With that expectant hush, it's wonderful when that happens. May I welcome you. My name is Peter Moyser, and I am the Dean of Leeds University Business School, and we are the hosts of this lecture tonight. And it's my great pleasure to invite you to what is our third annual lecture. The last two have been spectacularly successful, and we have high hopes for this one as well. Just before we get into the actual lecture itself, I just wanted to share with you some of the achievements that the business school has made this year, and just also for me to thank our staff for their passion and dedication. Many of my colleagues are here tonight, so I hope we have a chance to talk to them and at least listen to some of the success stories that we have. And just to give you a little vignette of the success that we had, we've been recently recruiting American academics, and we do it by Skype because they can't always get here on time. And we had one candidate who was toying. She had this decision to make. And she is a professor of decision theory. So the decision was, do I take the offer from Berkeley, California, or do I take the offer from Leeds? You know what the answer is. It's obvious, isn't it? A no-brainer, as they say. She's coming to Leeds. So that's the sort of standard of people we are beginning to attract. In terms of our student body, and I know many of you who were our students, I'd be interested to know how we are going. We're now very successful. We have 1,000 postgraduates this year and something of the order of 1,500 undergraduates. And we are looking forward with relish to the new world of 2012, as we call it, with the new fees. I think we'll be well placed for that. We're also in the process of revamping our MBA, and we've had lots of contributions from our alumni to help us make it more relevant. So those are just some of the things. And lastly, I just want to say that we are very concerned to remain accredited. Business schools are accredited in this world. There are 3 accreditation bodies. We currently have 2, and we will have the 3rd by 2013, which will mean we'll join the band of something like 115 business schools in the world with triple accreditation, which is what's called a triple crown. Now, our vision is to be a business school where you, our alumni, are involved, and also to try and engage you in our community long after graduation. What our aim is to do is to give you knowledge, connection, support, and inspiration, we hope, throughout your career. And we want you to feed some of that back to our students. It's fantastic when there's this relationship between alumni and students. The students benefit tremendously, and when I hear alumni talking, they gain as well. Because what I'm always impressed by is the quality of our students. You talk to them, and their drive, enthusiasm is a wonder to behold. So it is actually a very rewarding activity. Okay, in terms of trying to connect with our alumni, we have lecture series, and we've created quite a few of those this year. We've had events throughout the world. We've been in Beijing, Singapore, New Delhi, and Thailand. And all has the same effect of bringing people together as you are meeting up again, sometimes for many years, meeting old friends and colleagues. In the UK, we've held events in Leeds itself and in London. But this one is the highlight of the whole year. This 3rd annual alumni lecture is the crème de la crème. And it's clearly a great pleasure on my part to welcome Richard Guest. Richard graduated from the University of Leeds with a law degree in 1983, and I'm sure you all know he was a former BBC Wall Street Correspondent and is now the presenter of CNN's Quest Means Business. Now, as someone who's watched Richard on many TV screens throughout the world, I have to confess I never actually watch him in the UK, but when I'm abroad I do. I'm really looking forward to this talk. However, before you go to see the real thing, I think you should see for what Richard is really famous. And I shall leave you in the hands of the screen and hope the technology works. Thank you.
The start of a new week. I'm Richard Quest. Clearly, I mean business. Good evening. It is crunch time for Cadbury. After 2 years of improving its profitability, is it now rife for a takeover. If you want to understand currency exchange, look no further than the price of a burger. Toxic acid can poison the bank's balance sheet. Some are rotten, some rotten to the core, and some really won't affect the rest.
If you want to reboot the world economy, turn on Africa, Mr. Berlusconi, turn it on.
Do you think the $100 laptop is as important as basic education?
You've got to get your priorities right. When children are dying and vaccines aren't being delivered, that's the most important thing.
We need to move when the memory of the crisis, when the damage is still acute, the memory is still searing in its impact.
I'm going to learn how to do this. Funny business.
65-90 fence, and we go into the ring.
It may seem extreme, but upon such shouting rests the global economy. And if you look at the trending, the words that are being picked up on Twitter at the moment through the hashtags, that's what it looks like around the world. We've left the super screen in London, all that modern technology. We have the Swiss screen here in Davos. So we have the curve. And we will be asking, where are we on the curve?
I'd say somewhere between sort of on the curve and so jump somewhere about there.
Let me put it there.
I personally feel like the moment you are on the top of the curve.
You're in the middle.
I'm Swiss.
I have the power to take this money and, yes, pump it into the economy. That is quantitative easing. The dynamics change, and you have to play a different role.
Well, the dynamic changed when part of the European Union decided to have a single currency, the euro. That was the moment at which the dynamic changed.
It sounds to me that you're saying that Italy and Europe should talk its way out of the debt crisis.
Sure.
In today's era of high budget deficits in Europe, every little bit helps. Round two, the simulators.
20, retard.
Once again. It is the most difficult thing. London City guarantees the airlines that the planes will be turned round in 20 minutes. That's crucial to the profitability for the airlines of many of the routes. Where's my mop and my bucket?
Oh, yeah.
All right, one. There are perks to every job, even cleaning planes. Ooh. Copy The Economist. And that's CNN Business Traveller for this month. I'm Richard Quest, firmly in the left seat. Wherever your travels may take you, I hope it's profitable. And I'll see you next month. Good evening. What a spectacular place we are in tonight. And as soon as I arrived here, I thought, hang on, am I wearing the right clothes? Because I'm going to be talking about covering financial crises. And I thought, hang on, Mission Impossible. The costume of the Bourne Identity. And then I thought, no, a knight's tale, a bit of armour for going into battle. But the gangs of New York for all the Wall Street shenanigans, although I think that probably wouldn't match my hair. But then I thought, if I was really going to change costumes, which I'm not, this. Fred the Shred, Royal Bank of Scotland, from the movie Highlander. That would be the outfit to wear. I'm going to talk this evening from here. If it disturbs anybody because you can't see me and you wish to see me, which is not necessarily the same thing, then I can go up there. But I thought I would be a little bit more informal down here. Let me start by saying it is a truly daunting task being invited by one's former university to give a lecture. When the invitation arrives, my mind immediately was cast back to those long hours 3 decades ago in the Roger Stevens lecture hall. Watching professors wrestle with transparencies and overhead projectors. PowerPoints were a thing yet to be invented. And suddenly I was racked with worry. Think about it. How on earth was I going to give a lecture? Me, my public speaking, as you now have witnessed quite clearly, is limited to bursts of 2 or 3 minutes and is never challenged academically. So any of you expecting a rigorous academic lecture on the financial crisis, you're going to be seriously disappointed. What I will offer you instead tonight is a look at the financial crises of the past 25 years through the eyes and experience of someone who has covered them and who today is still at the coal face with the nightly programme Quest Means Business. I hope to give you an idea why these crises are so hard to discover, fiendishly difficult to actually cover, and why we do such a bad job with it generally. It was 1987 and I was just out of Leeds and I was in my news training at the BBC. The small screen, the little green computer, who remembers those little green computers, you know, long before Windows. Anyway, it was our link to Wall Street and the numbers on it were behaving very oddly. The numbers were flashing that we'd never seen before. The Dow Jones, which usually moved in single digits, was now moving in double and triple digits, and it was going down. The market was collapsing. This was Black Monday when the Dow dropped a staggering 22.5%, which still, incidentally, ranks as the single largest percentage fall in the US market. For me, every other financial crisis over the next 25 years has to be seen through the prism of covering those desperate days back in October of 1987, when we really didn't know whether financial Armageddon was on top of us. I was dispatched to Wall Street, where I heard the then CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, John Phelan. He said famously that this was the nearest thing he'd ever seen to a meltdown. And his exact words were, "It's the nearest thing to a meltdown I ever want to see." Here's the funny thing. It would be 20 years till I heard that phrase again, and this time from the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, talking about on 6th of October 2008, when it seemed that Britain's banks were going to go bust. During the coverage of the 87 crash, I learnt my first serious lesson. Rushing around like a blue-arse fly, trying to cover it left, right and centre, the then financial editor stopped me, Vincent Duggleby, he stopped me and he said, "Take it easy. These crises last for weeks, if not months. This will be going for a long time." It was an advice I was able to pass on to the younger generation in the 2007. A financial crisis is invariably a long haul. Forget what we may tell you on the television. It is a long haul. It is never a short sprint. In '87, the blame for the crash was put firmly on computer trading. And yet this was the first financial crisis where computers got the blame, not those who had programmed them. We were to see this again in May of 2010 with the so-called flash crash, when the Dow Jones fell nearly 1,000 points in less than 10 minutes. This time, it was high-frequency computer trading that was blamed. Now, I was on air at the time, a bowel-churning experience. Because the beauty of 24-hour news is crises happen in real time, and you have to cover them. And frankly, you've got no idea what is happening. You are literally making it up as you go along. You're hopingly drawing on a reservoir of experience and some knowledge. We watched the Dow fall, and we just did not know if this was going to continue falling. Of course, it didn't. It turned around and went back up again. What it tells you, though, is that it's a bit like covering a war, where you have hours of tedium followed by moments of intense action. And it's the same with covering markets and covering finance. The market moves like in the flash crash, and nothing happens after that. It's all quiet. And you have nothing to do for the next 3 weeks. The ERM crisis in this country in 1992 is another example. It happened, the markets fell, and then we had to pontificate for the next 6 months. The next real transatlantic crisis was the dot-com boom and bust of the 1990s. On both sides of the Atlantic, the market was roaring because of this new thing. It was called the Internet. Bill Clinton and Al Gore had described it as the information superhighway. The only problem with this superhighway was investors and journalists didn't know the rules of this new road. Companies which had absolutely no revenues, certainly no profits, were advertising like mad, coined a new phrase, the path to profitability. Every time I interviewed a chief exec of a firm like Pet.com or some other an equally unappetizing company, they would always say on their results, nah, we're not making money yet, but we're on the path to profitability. And here is the point. As a journalist who had been trained and steeped in traditional business journalism, it's hard to pin these people down. They treated me as someone who had failed to see the Messiah of the future. I was not one of the enlightened. They rolled their eyes and acid dripped from their tongues as they suggested I was a Luddite. And I was partly powerless to respond because the market was giving its own verdict. Between 1990 and the year 2000, the Dow Jones rose 389%, and everyone was entranced by what was taking place. So, you might ask, well, come on, Quest. You're supposed to be a journalist, bit of skepticism, bit of cynicism. Well, you had people like the chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, who did question the sustainability of it. He used the phrase irrational exuberance. But think about it. Who in their right minds is honestly going to say, this is a disaster, the sky is going to fall in? Because even Greenspan was preaching that the internet had created a new paradigm of productivity. He said it had rewritten the economic rules. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Irrational exuberance went out, and the Nasdaq collapsed 4,000 points, more than 77% from peak to trough. Now, here's a little tell. I actually bought stocks. Legitimately, there was no Daily Mirrors about them. And every one of those stocks in the internet companies I bought at the peak. I mean, that just shows how dreadful an investor I am. You know, when people always say to me, you know, what should they do with their money? I say, do you really think I'd be doing this if I could make money doing that? Anyway, most of the companies I bought in have gone out of business. Some, like Cisco, I paid $77 a share. It's trading at about 18 now. I turned a portfolio that cost me $60,000 into one that's worth about $16,000 today. But here's the point. I have never sold one share. I have never got rid of them. I keep them as a reminder of hubris, which I'm very wary of and aware of as we look at this next thing, which I will talk about later, social media. So we need to turn our attention now to the Great Recession of 2007. We can sum it up really simply. A US housing crisis turns into a global banking calamity, which spawns a European sovereign debt disaster and is still threatening us today. And it sounds so simple when I say it like that, but think of it this way. How could home mortgages in California and Florida eventually lead to the nationalizing of banks in Britain, a bankruptcy in Greece, and the near collapse of the euro? It's not part of my task today to describe the crisis and how it happened. But it is part of my job to answer the question from a journalist's point of view. The question was asked by the Queen in 2009 on a visit to the London School of Economics, when Her Majesty said, "Why did no one see it coming?" And I answer it tonight with the experience of Black Monday, dot-com boom and bust, computer trading, and all the evidence of stories that we had covered, or I'd covered. And I answer it with humility, because I didn't see the Great Recession coming. Oh yes, there were people like Nouriel Roubini of New York, nicknamed Dr. Doom. He was forecasting the worst, and worse still, and he's still forecasting it. But most of us thought he was a crank. And why? Because even in 2007, after 15 years of growth, the most we really thought was going to happen was a cyclical slowdown and possibly a minor recession. Why? Because there was no evidence to support anything else. It was against everything we were seeing in the market. This brings me to the fundamental points. Financial crises are just about impossible to predict accurately. The origins of the Great Recession is in hundreds, if not thousands, of annual bank lending statistics. Foreclosure numbers, Tier 1 capital ratios, credit rating reports, which we now know were a work of fiction. The problems were structural, such as the UK's tripartite agreement for regulation. It is the very nature of a financial crisis that it is what the US Senate called in its report, which took them 2 years to write, by the way. They didn't exactly do it speedily. It took them 2 years to decide that there was the cogs of the wheels of financial destruction, and they are deep in the heart of the market. It takes weeks, if not months, of detailed research to spot the weaknesses. So, some of you will be thinking, yeah, but that's your job, Quest. That's what we pay your money for. That's why we watch you on television. You're not pretty good if you can't spot that. All right, think of it this way. Think of a cooking stove with thousands of pots on it. Thousands upon thousands of pots on one cooking stove. And you have to work out which one is about to boil over when all of them are bubbling. And most of them are bubbling respectably. And you have to pinpoint which are the dangerous ones within that. Because economic crises do not happen overnight. And reporting the imbalances in a global economy is as dull as ditch water. I'll give you an example. This week, I have received a brokerage report, or an analyst report as we call them now. It talks about how transfers between Eurozone central banks through the payment system Target 2 are now showing worrying imbalances. Anybody want to watch a report on that? Because this is my second fundamental point. We couldn't have got the stories on air even if we'd wanted to. If the financial stories are hard to tell, they are just about impossible to sell in the newsroom. Never mind to you, and I'll get to you lot later. Before 2007, there was, and I think still is, an inherent animosity in most newsrooms to financial stories. Lord Burt, in the 1980s, described his theory of journalism as the bias against understanding. His lordship, he said basically, pictures are allowed to dictate the story, and journalists have no mission to explain. Well, when I worked for Burt, as one of his journos, I would never have criticised his theory or dreamt to have criticised the Oracle. Today, with 25 years behind me, I'm less deferential. I redefine Burtism as a bias against financial journalism. The mere sight and sound of a number, an index, sends editors running for the hills. And yet, senior editors and producers love strategic stories and adore geopolitical machinations, preferably involving a dictatorship and nuclear weapons. My diplomatic and foreign affairs colleagues get time galore for stories on obscure tribal conflicts which frankly threaten almost nothing, let alone the financial well-being of the developed world. There's a perceived gravitas in having someone from the Royal Institute of Worthy Studies on the programme to speculate to their heart's content, but I promise you, when I put a decent analyst on the air to talk about something like might be happening on credit derivatives, we're accused of jargon. Remember, it was Nigel Lawson that talked about teenage scribblers. 3 months ago, I had a blazing row with a colleague who kept glibly saying she didn't understand all that financial stuff and bailouts. But she thought nothing of immersing herself in the minutiae of the Afghan lawyer Jirga tribunals. My curt point to my colleague was to watch my programme and learn. The corollary to this financial incipience by many of my colleagues is that we don't get the time to delve into crises. 5 years ago, if I said I need to do a piece on the US housing market, which we know is overheating, and we hear that the German Landesbanks have got some pretty dodgy investments. You can imagine. Any more than the analyst who tried to warn the SEC twice about Bernie Madoff was listened to. And even today, I can tell in broadcast newsrooms in the US and in the UK, producers would rather grapple with this story, the economy, with a political twist. Focus on a coalition split. Look at how it deals with the politics of it, rather than truly get to grips with what a downgrade of a AAA means. And God forbid you throw in a number. Now, of course, this does not mean we don't try. We, of course, try to expose the weaknesses in the system and the way the companies and economies are being run. It's just very difficult to wheedle out this information and then get it on air. And it has to be done in the face of growing economies, rising markets, increasing wealth. And this is where you come in. You don't want to hear that this party isn't going to last, especially if you are trying to get an invitation to it and you feel that you're a Johnny-come-lately. Our competitor network, CNBC, discovered this in .com. In the good days when the Nasdaq was rising, everyone was watching CNBC and watching themselves get richer. When things turned sour and the Nasdaq collapsed, their viewers evaporated. It seems people don't like to see themselves getting poorer quite as much. And then here's the final fundamental rule. Even if I have all the evidence and I've managed to get the airtime and you're going to watch, we are met with a barrage of denial and abuse which calls into question the journalism and our credibility. And for that, I do not need to go back 20 years. I go back 20 months. As the European debt crisis brewed, time and again, we said Greece would need a bailout. Now, normally, we hedge ourselves. We use what Wikipedia calls weasel words. Sources say, it's widely believed, it's generally understood. But this time, responding to my failures in 2007 and 8, no mincing of words. Greece will need a bailout, and other countries will follow. And yet the Greek Prime Minister, on at least 3 occasions in interviews with me, denied even the possibility of it, as did President Barroso of the Commission and President Trichet of the ECB. Now, of course, I hear you say they're going to put a brave face on a really dreadful situation. But see it from both sides. They were denying bailouts right up until the moment they were writing the checks. And the same with Greece defaulting. They denied it right up until the day it happened. It's infuriating. Particularly when these same people will say privately to you what they won't say publicly, and then whisper, "Of course, old chap, I can't say that officially." I mentioned how difficult it is to swim against the tide of the trend, but I promise you, I feel I'm witnessing it all over again with something known as social media. 2 weeks ago, Facebook announced it was paying, or would pay, $1 billion for Instagram, a company with few revenues and fewer profits. Let us just pause for one moment. Anybody in here who regularly or uses Instagram, just raise your hand. Oh, we've got one. 2. Come on, Instagrammers. Fine. All right. I have been trying for weeks to get somebody to explain to me why Instagram is worth $1 billion of Facebook paper. Because even if it does have value, is it worth $1 billion? Out they come from the woodwork. The old .com soothsayers redux. This time, they're calling themselves social media experts or consultants, and they're suggesting that for me, as somebody as age 50, I can't be expected to understand. I feel like I'm watching history all over again. When Facebook launches itself on the market, as it will do with its IPO, will it really be worthy as one of the most valuable companies in the world? How many people use Facebook in here? Yeah, do you see? That's better. There's 900 million Facebookers around the world. But by every traditional barometer, this company's not worth that amount of money. A bubble is starting to build up again. And as surely as it is happening, as journalists covering the story, I have decided to be much more skeptical, and I'm already feeling the backlash. I do not defend the fact I missed the financial crisis. I wish I was one of those people of whom it's now said, Quest saw it coming. But this was the first crisis of the true global era, where rotten market foundations festered in one part of the world were able to infect another across an ocean. What I defend is the way we cover these crises. After Lehman and Britain's banking crisis, I was constantly asked, are we going into a recession? To me and anyone who's covered markets since the 80s, the answer was obvious. You can't have that level of dislocation without a recession. But guess what? The politicians denied it, didn't they? In fact, they continued denying it until the fat lady was singing. And in fact, they continued to deny a double dip in Britain until the numbers came out yesterday and were described as very disappointing. So we have to use different and imaginative ways to cover these crises. You saw, for example, one of them there. Take quantitative easing. It was interesting, quite funny to see how all the different networks described quantitative easing on the day when the Bank of England did it. One poured oil into a car engine and said that showed money lubricating the economy. Another showed a racetrack. We went for, and you saw it in that video, I went for building the 5-tier champagne tree, and then we poured the water through it. Ladies and gentlemen, what I learned in 1987, and I've seen numerous times since, is that witnessing a market in full flight can be a terrifying ordeal. Markets are living, moving organisms because they are the product of the people who take decisions, even in a case where it is a computer or the actions of machines. It is still humans, ultimately, who are involved. And behind the movements of the screen, behind those movements are people like you and me. It may be a travelling salesman who's worried about how the company will survive a growing recession. It's almost certainly a pensioner who's now concerned that their capital will last through their lifetime. And usually there's also the disadvantaged who know that their lifeline benefits will be the victim of austerity cuts. In an ideal world, we would do a much better job of covering financial crises before they happen. But for the reasons I've given, that is simply neither realistic nor possible. The stories are beyond the resources of most journalists and most organisations. The editors won't run them because of a bias against complex financial stories, and you won't watch them because you're too busy trying to work out how you can make money out of what is no doubt a bubble that is about to burst. So I am left on Quest Means Business with my simple mission each night. I promise you only two things. I will give you the facts. I will give you the best analysis there is in the world. And then it is up to you. Just please don't blame me afterwards. I shall be more than happy to take questions.
Felder, 1979 graduate. I'd like to know a little bit how you got into CNN and how you moved from being a law graduate and got where you are today.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so I graduate in 1984, 83, because then I got the scholarship. I don't know whether Leeds still does it. I had a scholarship to Vanderbilt University. Leeds had an exchange student arrangement with Vanderbilt, and they made a complete cock-up of it. They were not supposed to give the scholarship to somebody from the law department because Vanderbilt didn't have a one-year law program. So I went off to Nashville, Tennessee with a good dollop of Leeds' money and had nothing really to do because the law school didn't really have anything for me to do. So I started in the, I'd already done local radio, hospital radio, and I worked for the campus radio station there, WRVU. When I came back, I thought my late father decided, well, this journalism thing was all very good, but you better have something in your back pocket. So I did the bar, which I'd enjoyed. And I wouldn't have minded practicing. I like law. But I wanted to try and be a top correspondent. And I wanted to get, I thought, what can I get to 40 and regret least? And I thought, I've really got to try. And I was lucky I got the BBC scheme. And then just after the millennium, I just decided it was time to move on. I'd gone as far with the BBC as I was going to. I could see the writing on the wall in the corporation. And so I was one of those rare people who worked for a British company in the United States, and I now work for a US company in the UK. And here's the interesting thing. If you're going to move in broadcasting, there really are only about 2 or 3 organizations that have the quality and the standard that you would move towards globally. And just to prove that I'm not completely biased to my employer, you know, the BBC, CNN obviously, they pay my mortgage, Sky News in the UK, the ABC Australia, the CBC. But even the ABC and the CBC don't have anything like the resources, even Sky has nothing like the resources we do. So that's how I came to be at CNN, the world's news leader. Excuse me. Yes, sir.
Alan Hughes, I chair the advisory board of the business school. I'll ask the obvious question. Murdoch and his Levinson, I mean, is he fit to run a media organisation?
Well, I always enjoy an optimist asking a question that he knows he's not going to get an answer to. All right, so late last night, because I hadn't really had a chance to watch in great detail, I thought, sad bugger that I was, and I thought I'm just going to watch an hour online of Leveson. You watch Murdoch, and I watched him today partly, you come away from it. I mean, the man is 81. I hope that I'm not just dribbling into my dotage at 81, let alone be able to give 4.5 hours of cogent, coherent evidence against Robert JQC. He was very honest. Forget what he says about my papers tell the truth. He was very honest. I interfere in the Sun. I didn't interfere in the news of the world. I believe in this, I believe in that, I believe in the other. I think we can take... What's fascinating is where the discrepancy between his view of what Gordon Brown said and Gordon Brown saying a conversation never even took place. I mean, that's a hell of a difference. It's a bit different if Gordon had said, we had a conversation and that's not my recollection. But Brown says, I only had one conversation with Rupert Murdoch in the last year of my office, and it was about Afghanistan. And Murdoch says, Brown said, you've declared war and I'm going to declare war on you. Now, someone's not telling the truth. Would anybody like to speculate who it might be? I think Murdoch comes out of this evidence in a much stronger position. Having seen his shambolic Gaga style delivery at the select committee, this was a much more polished performance. James Murdoch is a different kettle of fish. I think that he might be holed beneath the waterline. Now, how many think in here, let's face it, how many people in here think that they will be judged to be not fit and proper people to run a network, a television network? Well, that's a different matter. So we've got one person. How many think that they won't be judged that? You've answered the question. The next question.
Michael Russell, a former banker and also a Leeds University alumni. If George Osborne was to call you into his office and say, I know you're a journalist, but I would like to hear your advice as to how, Richard, you get me out of this pickle of no growth and deficit cutting, what would you recommend to him?
At this point, it was put brilliantly to me. What they're trying to do is they're trying to cut the grass at the same time as grow it. And that's the problem. If at this point in the process, I suspect there is no other alternative other than to keep going. I think it could, you can tinker around at the edges. You can, the train has left the station. The time for backtracking on your austerity would have been mid to late last year. If they start backing off on the austerity now, the danger is that all the work will start to unwind. Because, I don't have much sympathy for governments of either persuasion, but they do have a point. If you bear in mind, yes, Britain's gone into a technical recession, but everybody's questioning the ONS's numbers, and it's highly likely that it'll be reversed. But look at France. Look at Spain. Look at Italy, all these other countries. It's just about impossible for any European country to stand in the way against the weight of that tsunami of bad news. And if you did reverse the austerity, where would you start? You'd raise government spending. You'd start going higher on the deficit, a deficit that's already going to be 8-9%. So you push it back towards 10%. You'd raise, I mean, okay, fine. You could rescind the idea of cutting the 45, you could go back to the 50% tax break. But nobody in this room for 1 minute believes that the higher rate of tax actually raises a serious amount of money. If you do believe that, put your hand up, because I can point you in the HMRC report that came out at the budget that proves the numbers. So you're left in a really difficult bed that has been made, and you're probably better off staying with it at the moment, because growth will come from the United States, going to grow 2.5% to 2.7% this year. China is still growing. I mean, the doomsayers are worried. China's down to 8.1%, calamity. India's still at 7-8%. Oh, tragedy. They will pick up speed again. You've still got German growth that will come through later this year. I certainly wouldn't reverse course.
Richard Servant, part of the Leeds Advisory Board, Business School. I have a question around the social media for you. I do some work on trends, mega trends. And one of the trends we predicted is value for many.
Oh! So, is this the new path to profitability?
Yeah. So it's not value for money, but value for many. So it's about making products for the masses, but also leveraging the internet, the Web 2 platform to sell to millions and billions of people. So the question is, what do you think about this value for many? And because Facebook is value for many, 900 million people, what do you think about its valuation on the stock exchange?
Okay, the first thing is, my view is, if somebody's prepared to pay something for that, then that has to be accepted as a fact. You can't argue with that. So if Facebook launches and it's worth $1 gazillion, that is just a fact that you live with. Do I think it's barking mad? Absolutely. You've got companies that barely have any employees, a couple of thousand employees, if that. Instagram has something like 23 employees. Compare that to General Electric or to Boeing, McVitie's Biscuits, whichever company you want. The moment you go down the road of saying that these companies are worth tens of billions, hundreds of billions, you've lost touch with reality. And it will end badly. This time, I'm not going to hedge my bets. I was sick. The only person, there's only one CEO from that dot-com boom and bust era, that Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And he and I used to go hammer and tongs every quarter because the losses were there, the losses were there, the losses were there. And he said, we're on the path to profitability. Amazon is just about the only one. Everybody else from that era? AOL merged with my own parent company and created the biggest weapon of wealth destruction that's ever been seen. Yahoo? Who? What? Is in the most terrible straits, even traditional computer companies. IBM sold off to Lenovo, HP nearly went belly up. So I do believe, I'm a Luddite. I come from Leeds. I'm born in Liverpool, lived in Leeds. If you're not making something, there's probably something wrong. Next question.
Richard. Hi. Kandar Kapte, Business School alumnus from 2004. I am a banker, so don't throw anything at me. I've had that happen.
What sort of banker?
I originate high-yield bonds.
Oh! High-yield bonds. Right. So
junk any longer, it's called
high yield, yeah. I was talking of junk bonds.
Yeah. My question doesn't fit.
No, I didn't think it would. But I was in court the day Michael Milken, the junk bond king, got sentenced. I can still see him crying in the dock as he'd had his wig taken off, and Judge Kimberwood sent him off to prison. I didn't see Boski, but I remember very clearly Michael Morgan. I'm sorry, I digress.
Michael's still making a ton of money, I can tell you that.
There's no justice. Never said there was. Go on, your question.
I have a two-part question.
I yield. These have two parts. We'll spend the second part answering the first. Go on.
Right. Do you find that the European media doesn't seem to have any problems getting financial stories out? Let's take Robert Peston, for instance. He seems to go on the air and banker bash at any given time. And the second part...
I don't understand the question.
As in, does the European media seem to... You suggested that you had a lot of pressure on you not to get negative financial stories.
No, I didn't say that. No, sorry, forgive me, I didn't mean that. I meant there's just a bias against stories with numbers and indices. Now it's different, of course, because of 2007, 2008. There is an appetite for financial stories. But my point is, Peston gets stories because they're leaked. Don't get any great idea, and I like Robert, and I've known Robert. Well, no, I am actually. I think he's a superb journalist. But whether it's Peston, Randall, myself, we do not dig stories out. Like, back to Murdoch, like the thalidomide story. You get stories because somebody leaks it to you. Somebody rings you up and says, I've just been in a meeting where X, Y, and Z has happened. And then your organization only has one choice or one decision to make. Do you go with it? Is it real? Are you being used? Is it going to end badly? So let's, but your second part.
Second part's, do you think that, people like Robert Peston have too much of a sway on, let's say, a nationalized organization like RBS? Do you feel that RBS would have been in a better place, like, let's say, Citi has, which was nationalized as well at about the same time, if people like Robert Peston didn't constantly get stories on the air about how much Stephen Hester was being paid, how much bankers were being paid?
No, I don't for one moment. And the evidence for that is that Citi, Vikram Pandit, just last week, lost the support of investors for their pay package. So Citi in the US had just as much of a beating up as RBS did. The difference was Citi was fundamentally sound, RBS was not. Citi took money, but it didn't need to be fully nationalized. RBS needed to be, would not have survived. Citi would have survived. Even when Citi's share price broke the buck, it would have survived. It still had assets it could have disposed of. But RBS was a basket case that needed to be pulled out of the gutter.
Well, just to correct you, that Citibank did lose that, Vikram Pandit's pay package didn't get approved because a large number of shareholders who didn't vote were actually presumed to vote against it.
Right. Did Citi or did Citi not have problems with the remuneration package? Are you with Citi, by the way? Oh, right. But the point I'm making is, Citi did take a bashing in the US. It took a bashing because it's named a football field or a baseball field or something, the Citi Field, wherever it is in New York. It took a bashing over that. It's taken numerous bashings. So I don't think that you can, and I like Robert Peston, I certainly don't think you can blame RBS's problems or Stephen Hester's problems or Fred Goodwin's problems and certainly not Fred Goodwin's.
I believe Fred deserves his reputation.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Stuart Killen, I'm a retired solicitor. Very simple, naive question. Who's going to be the Mayor of London on the 4th of May?
Who in this room... Well, it's an appropriate one, isn't it? We're in the old GLC headquarters. Who's going to be the Mayor on the 5th of May? Is it the election? Is the voting on the 4th? That's for right. Okay, I have absolutely no intention of giving an answer to that question. I can quote you the polls, but if you think I'm going to nail my colours to the mast while somebody tweets, Quest of CNN just forecasted XYZ would be the new ex-mayor of London. But I think it will be a mayor. Yes, sir.
Rohit Bhatia, class of 2007. Work as an equity analyst right now.
2007?
2007, so fairly recent.
Oh, you timed it badly, didn't you?
Very, very badly.
Really badly? Wow, that must be expensive. Carry on.
So the question really is on Europe. This is on the back of what George Soros had to say. He thinks that the problems of Europe have just been delayed by a few years rather than being solved right now. What is your view, and do you think he's right, or is Europe just heading for something more cataclysmic?
I have absolutely no doubt. Back to mine. Europe has in no way whatsoever dealt with the fundamental problems. They have papered over the cracks. But here's the funny thing. They knew. One thing I do get a bit wearisome with people with other journalists sometimes and commentators, when they say, you know, Europe built the Eurozone, and they didn't know what they were doing, and they got it wrong, and they didn't realize they needed to have fiscal as well as monetary union. Of course they knew. Read Otmar Issing's book on the birth of the euro, which was written before the crisis. And he was one of the authors. He was one of the euro. In an interview with me, he made it clear. They knew this was a ticking time bomb to have monetary union without fiscal union. But what they hoped was that this would happen organically, that over a period of years, the governments would see the obviousness and the righteousness of coming together, and imbalances would be worked out in that way. What they didn't bank on was, the old saying, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. And they didn't bank on the tide roaring out in 2009 for Greece, which showed the imbalances for what they were. Do I think the euro is going to collapse? No. Absolutely not. And I'll give you a warning. 300 million people use the euro every single day. If the euro collapses, would the last person on the continent switch off the lights? You'll have riots, you'll have civil insurrection, you will have the most god-awful calamities in Europe. So will the euro remain in its current form? Probably not. But it will not collapse. And with that, it collapsed. No. Any more questions? Oh.
With that, we have one more question.
The pressure's on. It better be a good one.
Sorry, the pressure is on. Nicola Evans from 2000. This is actually going back to the social media element, more from a journalistic point of view. How have you found it affecting your news and your journalism generally?
Oh, great question to end on. How is social media affecting the journalism? It's a bloody pain in the arse. In the old days, you watched the television and you sent a self-addressed envelope to the BBC London W1A 4WW. And you might or might not get your request played on the air. And then you go to the 1990s, when people like myself said, yes, email us at quest@cnn.com. Now we're tweeting and twittering as if there's no tomorrow. But you've got to do it. I actually do quite like Twitter. When I'm traveling somewhere and I'm bored, I'll start tweeting. Because you do feel like you're talking to people and they do reply, and it's quite sad. But here's a funny point about tweeting. particularly if you've got quite a few followers or you're in the public gaze, the urge to say something just downright inflammatory to see what happens is overwhelming sometimes. Because you're sitting in an airport, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you know that you could tweet just anything. But you forget about the repercussions. I was once delayed out of South Africa. I was at Cape Town, and there was virtually a riot at the airport because the plane was late. And I tweeted that South African Airways had clearly screwed up. I landed in Johannesburg to find my tweet on the front page of the paper. And, you know, texts from and emails from CNN asking from management, what was I saying and why was I saying it? More than one person has lost their job, not just in our organisation but elsewhere, for inappropriate tweeting. So I now practice safe tweeting, which you can imagine what that involves.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we have to close now, but what a talk. It's been brilliant, and I'm sure we'd just like to express our appreciation for what has been a fascinating and entertaining call. Thank you.
Thank you.